From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I think it's 12:01, so we're going to start the program because she has a lot of things to cover and then want to talk to you about. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all. My name is Sonia Lee, Korea Reference Specialist at the Asian Division, Library of Congress. Today's lecture is for the Moral Science in Postwar North Korea by Dr. Dafna Zur. So Dr. Dafna Zur is assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the Stanford University. She teaches a course on Korean literature, cinema, and popular culture. Her book, Figuring Korean Futures, Children's Literature in Modern Korea, published by the Stanford University Press in 2017, traced the effective investment and coded aspiration made possible by children's literature in colonial and post-colonial Korea. She has published numerous articles on North Korean science fiction, Korean War in North and South Korean children's literature, and children's in cinema and Korean popular culture. So now, without further ado, please give a big welcome to Dr. Dafna Zur.
All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. This is the fanciest venue I've ever spoken at, and I think from now on it's just going to be downhill for me. So I'm going to try and just, milk it for what it's worth. Thank you to my dear friend Sonia Lee, who has worked tirelessly for all these years to make this Korean collection. Just such a fantastic collection. It should be a kind of a world destination as far as I'm concerned for anyone who's interested in North Korea, especially Cold War period. And of course to all, thank you to all the guests today. My aunt and uncle are here, as well as friends, and I'm just so honored to be speaking with you today and to have a chance to introduce my work. So what I'm going to do today is to briefly introduce some of the materials that we have here at the Library of Congress. In fact, I have a slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we study North Korea, those of us who are studying especially from a historical perspective. What are our tools? How do we go about doing that? I'm going to then talk about the Library of Congress collection and what it has to offer. And lastly, I'm going to talk about my own interest in North Korean science and science fiction and tell you a little bit about how I came to study this topic, and I will end with a little bit more sort of in detail examination and share with you some of my recent findings. So how do we study North Korea? I mean, this may seem like a very simple question, but many of us can't travel there, including myself. I have not been to North Korea. A lot of my, as I was telling someone before, a lot of my European colleagues, in fact, go quite frequently. They are, of course, also limited into the kind of materials that they have access to, but we can't go, right? And we don't have access to their archives, whatever those might look like. We also can't do what we call field work, right? We can't go and interview people or get a sense of, how people live and how they interact. So much of our knowledge is built through printed materials. Right? We try and get as much access to a broad range of materials, magazines, newspapers, leaflets, school textbooks, whatever we can get our hands on, basically, to try and piece together a sense of kind of the lived reality and that, on the ground in North Korea. So everything is fascinating, and everything can really help us, from literary sources to popular sources, specialized, general, anything we can get helps build this kind of more complete picture of North Korea for those of us working on this historical period. So I want to talk a little bit about what the range of materials out there are. So one of the big sources, or the important sources that have served a lot of the historians working on North Korea, are what's called the capture documents that are held in the National Archives that were collected by the U.S. Army during the Korean War. And these archives, I myself have not been to those archives. I've seen them. I've talked to a lot of my colleagues who have. They're basically boxes and boxes of papers that were taken by the U.S. military during the Korean War. They sit there, and historians go and they just sort of try and piece together this kind of very chaotic kind of archive. And so that archive has served as a foundation for studies of history, for example, by Professor Susie Kim from Rutgers University, Professor Charles Armstrong from Columbia University, Charles Armstrong has a couple of books. So these archives in the National Archives have really served to create a kind of foundation for understanding what was going on the ground in North Korea in the 1950s. But as I said, they're very, very, as I understand, they're very chaotic. These are loose papers lying in boxes, and you have to kind of really spend a long time trying to make sense of them. The next kind of source that we have are former Soviet archives. So, this is, I always think if I could do it all again, I would learn Russian and Korean, as well as, many other languages. There's never enough time. But my colleagues who have traveled to Moscow, I'm going there in May, so I'm very excited about that. But there's a national library there with great archives. I have colleagues working, in other former Soviet languages that have access to foreign service documents and so on. So those are also really great places to mine for documents relating to early North Korea, 1950s, 1945 to 1955, 1960, et cetera. And we have also, I did say before that it's hard for us to travel to North Korea and talk to North Koreans, but as we know, there are increasing number of defectors that are settling. Most of them are settling in South Korea, but a lot of them also find their way to the United States and to other countries in the world. And they are very important sources for understanding what life is like at the moment. There are some challenges with these oral histories. Mostly that there are not that many defectors, and they have what we call interview fatigue. They can often get interviewed by many number of journalists, of scholars, anthropologists, people working on North Korea. And so we don't have enough of a range. Also, a lot of the defectors do tend to come from, let's say, Pyongyang. They come from a certain class, and so they do give insights into a certain place in time, but the range can be a little bit limited. So oral histories are important, and they're getting done, but they also are not. You cannot give at this time a complete picture. And lastly, the published materials that we can find in library collections around the world. So I mentioned Moscow before. Many of you may be surprised or not surprised to know that South Korea actually does not have a, oh gosh, I'm being recorded. Their collection is more limited, shall we say. And it may not be surprising to those of you who know something about South Korean laws and the way that there has just been the access to North Korea has been really limited in South Korea. So right now, the only place that you can get access to North Korean printed materials in South Korea is on the 5th floor of the Chungang Doso관, which is the main library or the central library in Seoul. You go in there, much like the Library of Congress, I guess. You have to give your passport. They take down all your personal information. They want to know exactly who is coming in and out of that library. And their collections tend to be a little bit more limited in scope. They have a lot more, I think, sort of 1980s, post-1980s materials, some from the 60s and 70s, but that's a much more kind of limited collection. In the United States, I would say the two biggest, or the largest collections are at Harvard, at the Yenching Library, and by far this wonderful library, the Library of Congress. And so, as I said, and I actually don't know as much about the history of this archive. I would maybe Sonali can fill me in later or maybe add to the discussion. But what I know is that we have here in the Asian Meeting Room just down the hall 274 journals from North Korea, going all the way back to what we call the liberation space in 1945. It is the largest collection of North Korean serials from the 1940s to the 1960s, so really the most exciting, as far as I'm concerned, period of North Korean history, including recent publications from North Korea. So it's not only a historical archive, it's also very, very current. So that's that. And even more exciting, just as of, I think, a couple of days ago, it has been made known to me that we now have, thanks to a generous grant, the beginnings of a database of searchable articles in the North Korean serials. Not all of them, just a number, but just the fact that you can type in keywords. You know, I'm interested in articles having to do with agriculture or with nuclear, nuclear development or, women's rights or whatever. You can plug in those keywords and you will get access to, in a much more focused way. While as, until now, it's the good old fashioned, you go in there, you take out, 50 books and then you just sit and start going through them and looking for a needle in a haystack, although that's actually usually yields a lot of fun things, as I'll talk about later. You usually find things by accident. That's another real advantage, I think, to not really knowing what you're looking for. So these articles give us insight into policy, economics, political, social, historic, military, legal, financial, and governmental issues. So it's really, like I said, a rich, rich archive. There's something for everyone, but you have to read Korean. And as I said, it's searchable articles right now from only 18 journals. What do we say? We have 274, so this is just a small sampling of important journals. So it's a wonderful beginning, and if anyone knows of any well-intentioned donor who wants to help us build this archive, then I'll give you Sonia Lee's email, and we can keep working on that archive. It's that database. It's extremely important. Okay, so that's until now just kind of an introduction to what we have here at the Library of Congress, which is just a gem for those of us who are interested in early North Korean history. And so a little bit about how I came to this field. So in 2007, I was looking for a dissertation topic. Those of you who know, in the process of getting your PhD, the all-important, what is my dissertation going to be? What's going to be my territory? My mark in the field. And I had different ideas. I kind of came to Korean studies via a circuitous route. I grew up in New York and in Israel, and I was a soldier, but I also did martial arts, and I got to Korea, and I had a lot of different interests. I was very curious about travel literature. I'll talk a little bit about that today, but as a traveler and as a person who has kind of lived in different places, I was really interested in how people kind of understand what traveling means and what they're actually looking at, et cetera, et cetera. So I was looking for a different topic for my dissertation. But at that time, my older son was 2 years old, and my parents had saved all my children's books from when I was young, when I was very little, and they brought it over. I was in Vancouver at the time, and I was reading my old books to my children, and it occurred to me, my husband is Korean, and I have a big Korean family, but it occurred to me that I knew nothing about Korean children's literature. And I was just really curious what is out there. So, I just started by thinking about what's being published now, picture books. I looked a little bit at, was interested a little bit in the Korean War and how that was being portrayed in children's literature. But soon enough, I got sucked into the colonial period, and that was where I spent the last 10 years thinking about how children's literature emerged in Korea under Japanese colonial rule, which was from 1910 to 1945. But the first journal or magazine for non-adult readers came out in 1908. So I was really became interested in what children's literature is in Korea and how it emerged and how it kind of what was the relationship between this literature and the, the following 4 or 5 decades of both colonial rule and ideological fracturing and whatnot. So I became interested in literature for children, and that became the topic of my dissertation, and now the book that was published in 2017. But one day I was, I got an email that goes on this Korean Studies listserv, and there was an announcement about a special grant to go to the Library of Congress and check out the archives. And I had not realized that there were going to be Korean language materials in this library, and I looked, I went into the website. I was at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, UBC it's called, and there's no money there for graduate students. So like, oh, somebody's going to give me money to go check out an archive. I got to see what this is. So I went into the website, and I just typed in children's literature, adongmun학 in Korean, and a page popped up, and there were multiple books and magazines that showed up, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And all of a sudden I realized that they were published in Pyongyang. And so I thought, oh my gosh, I hit a gold mine. I had not heard of this. No one that I knew was working on children's literature. I never thought that we would have something on North Korea. So that was the first time I came to this library, went to the Asian reading room. Sonia at the time and the other librarians brought out all these materials. And it was just kind of such an eye-opener. So that's what I mean when you look for something and you find something else by accident, that turns out to be the really kind of exciting stuff. And so, let me just see where I am. So when I came to the Library of Congress and I was looking through these materials, this Adongmun학 magazine, I, at the time, was really interested in the Korean War. Just found it to be such a tragic, but also really fascinating conflict. So I was just interested in, I guess, growing up also in Israel and having my own fair share of exposure to massive conflicts. I was just really interested in how this shows up for children. And so lo and behold, I found picture books of all kinds, both from the 1950s and 60s in this children's magazine, but also more from the 80s and even 90s. And so at this juncture, I was able to put together a publication. It was my first article, and it helped me understand how the Korean War has been narrated in picture books and fiction for young readers. And I was trying to understand how these picture books mobilized certain sentiments through these images, and also, to try and gauge whether or not I can read a little bit of kind of nuance or resistance, or not just to read them sort of top down, this is the way you're supposed to think and nobody ever thinks otherwise, but just to try and see how I can kind of put myself in the shoes of the readers and see if I can kind of understand or find any nuance. But in any case, I'm going to share some of the images with you. So I was looking, for example, at images of South Koreans and how they were represented as perhaps, not perhaps, but groveling and hapless and impotent. So, the South Koreans are painted in this extremely negative light. They are mostly, as you'll see in this next image, basically puppets at the hands of the Americans. So the Americans, of course, are painted in extremely negative ways, with these grotesque features. They basically just boss around the South Koreans. They are morally depraved. This is one of my favorite images. It's actually North Koreans disguised as South Koreans. It's really interesting. And they walk in on the American base, and of course, there they are drunk with some kind of cans opened, and there's, the bottle is surely some kind of, alcohol, and they're sleeping. And there's a picture, I love this, if you'll notice on the left-hand side, the picture there seems to be of a nude. So, all these ways in which, the Americans are portrayed in these very, very negative ways, and so on and so forth. So really trying to understand, okay, how are these images making their way into the, let's say, national imagination and how North Koreans are raised to think about this conflict. I also became really interested, maybe because of my kind of morbid sensibility, but I became really interested in just in portrayals of violence in general, and trying to understand where this was coming from and what the purpose of such violent images were. And of course, all of this is within a context of, this post-war period in which the United States reduced North Korea to rubble with, constant bombing. And these images I found, or I argued, really helped to sort of dehumanize the American enemy, desensitize readers, I think, to a certain extent, and really sustain sentiments of hostility in a context where there's so little contact, right? I mean, this is, we're 70 years now after the Korean War, and there has not been, there have been hot conflicts around the DMZ, and, God forbid that there shouldn't be anything more than that, and hopefully, well, anyway. So, but there is, so I think that these kinds of images serve a certain function of trying to maintain a kind of attitude or stance when in the absence of a kind of outright conflict. And so what I tried to show in some of my early publications is that the Korean War, these images from children's literature really help us understand how, even over 70 years, this conflict can be made meaningful and feel fresh to North Koreans who are, so many of whom are growing up without living memory of the war. And so, especially in light of what you would think of, how children's literature does tend to sanitize certain more difficult content, I found this to be extremely interesting. And I focused in particular on this one image at the end of one of the books that I covered, where you have this young North Korean soldier named Song-hwan, who is pictured here moments before his death. He survived a torture that was dealt to him by these menacing American captors, and their threat is sort of accentuated by the darkened shadows behind them. Their faces are so grotesque. But he has these rosy cheeks, this kind of sharp look in his eye, looking into the distance. He's very beautiful. And so I was trying to kind of understand the sort of physical and spiritual transcendence that a lot of these images embody as models for the desire for a kind of unity and renewal and an end to the conflict. And so I argued that the graphic violence in North Korean illustrations, both violence that's dealt to the enemy and that is inflicted upon these youngsters, is, turns them into martyrs, and it becomes part of this performance where the ultimate goal is a sort of regeneration of the North Korean nation. So that was one of the early publications. But as I was doing this work, I happened to come across these images. They caught my eye, and I just sort of did a double take. I said, what is this? And it was really, again, I wasn't looking for this material. I was just kind of focused on Korean War-related materials. And I found these images in Adong Munak, in the children's magazine. And yes, this is science fiction from North Korea. And so I found that science fiction narratives, and this led to a publication that came out in 2014 out of the Journal of Asian Studies called Let's Go to the Moon. And I found that science fiction narratives that appeared in this magazine from 1955 in translation from the Russian, and then on from 1956, you have these original short stories and longer novels. And I argued that they bear witness to a certain extent to the significant Soviet influence in the formative period of the Soviet Union. But rather than just talk about these images as imitations of Soviet materials, that it's just a kind of a derivative. I tried instead to locate science fiction narratives within North Korean discourses on children's literature that was preoccupied with the role of fiction as both a reflection of the real, of reality, and also a projection of the imminent utopian future. So through close readings of science fiction narratives from this period, I underscored the way that science, technology, and the environment are implicated in North Korean political discourses of development, and point to the way in which these works resolve the inherent tension between the desirable and seemingly contradictory qualities of the ideal scientist, who is both an obedient servant of the collective and tireless questioner of received and accepted truths. And thus these North Korean narratives of science fiction establish the child scientist as the true kind of protagonist of North Korea. And so I started there with this publication. Wanted to just give you also a taste of some of the fun findings. On your right-hand side is Adong Munak, a picture of one of my favorite novels from 1960. And to the left is a suspiciously similar image from 1954 from the Soviet magazine Pioner. So you can really see that there is borrowing, there is kind of intertextual references. This image on the right did not credit the image on the left, but they're very open about the relationship with the Soviet Union and their interest in exploring, outer space and going into deep sea exploration and whatnot. And so this really kind of gave me an opportunity to think about North Korea, to appreciate how truly global and international North Korea was in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, with the Soviet bloc, but there was so much exchange, scientists going back and forth, that is really just a fascinating period. And more recently, I have looked into some translations. So I was able to track down, actually it started with this publication on the far right. This was something I found in the Library of Congress in my last visit last May or April, I don't remember when I was here, but it was a short story in two parts called Flight to the Moon or Travel to the Moon. And it said in very small letters that it is a Soviet translation of a Soviet novel. And so with the help of a wonderful student in the Slavic department at Stanford, I was able to trace both the original cartoon from 1953 and the 1955 script. And then this translation from 1956 helped me not just to say, oh, North Korea is just copying or it's just a derivative of Soviet materials, but to actually look at the way that the Korean text played with and changed and tweaked and transformed the original Russian to suit its own purposes. So again, when those of us who do work with translation, it's always very, very interesting to do these comparisons, because you realize that of course those of us who translate know this, but translation is interpretation, right? I mean, these translators are interpreting the original and they are making more, making of it something of their own. Okay. So in the remaining time, and I do want to leave time for questions, but I want to share with you my new project, which I'm really, really excited about. This is coming, again, this is all materials that came out of the Library of Congress collection, and this new article that is coming out in September is titled Making Science Moral, the Story of Data in Post-War North Korea. So in 1953, North Korea was a budding nation seeking to rebuild itself from the rubble of, and it pinned its hopes on engineers and scientists. Ambitious goals could be set, but without collective resolve or the skills necessary to turn these visions into reality, these goals were meaningless. So to this end, the new government worked quickly to eradicate illiteracy, establish a compulsory education system, and to cultivate institutions of higher learning. The injection of foreign capital from socialist countries was also instrumental to North Korea's post-war development of science and technology, as was the integration of experienced scientists from overseas, including from South Korea. The Soviet-inspired Kwahagwan, or Academy of Sciences, was established in 1952 in order to ensure the speedy development of science and technology and to centralize its research activities. So what I find really interesting is that, at the risk of stating the obvious, the scientific And I'm talking here about science and popular science magazines for young readers in North Korea. The scientific is always framed in ideological terms, but ideology is shot through with morality. So ideology, in its broadest terms, is a set of conscious and unconscious political beliefs that are produced and reproduced symbolically and that help preserve power and dominance of certain interest groups. But ideology is inherently normative, meaning that ideology establishes behavioral norms and guides the way that social actors make sense of their world and determine what's good and evil. So I set out in this project to understand the relationship between the ideological and the moral through science and general interest magazines for Korean youth. And in this article, I take note of the manner in which scientific and the ideological content came to acquire a moral cadence in these magazines published in the 50s and 60s. And so in my article, I make three arguments. First, I argue that the moral landscaping of youth was seen as vital to North Korea's future, and that science and general interest magazines were useful tools for teaching morality and restructuring two important relationships in moral terms: youth and nature, and youth and community. And I call this section Making Science Moral. Second, I argue that the moment that science moves through language and is organized in textual and visual narrative is the moment that science becomes both rhetorically potent and also potentially volatile. So I call that section The Story of Data. And third and last, I argue that it is this volatility, was traced to the youthful mind, or the space of the imagination or fantasy. And it was the most elusive and therefore the most urgent need of restructuring. And so I call this last section Fantasy, the Final Frontier. And so I mean to show that it was not just the logic of ideology, but morality that was invoked in order to secure a scientific, political, and social utopia. So as I said, this is based on these wonderful materials gathered from the Library of Congress. These are just some of the just wonderful, wonderful covers. We have four different magazines here. 과학 세계, or Science World, is on the far left. And then we have 소년 과학 right next to it, so junior science. 소년단 translates roughly as Boy Scouts or Scouts. And then 세세대, or new generation, is on the far right. So with the exception of the one on the far left, 과학 세계, which was aimed at a general audience, not youth per se, the other three are aimed at school-age readers, middle to high school and even college. And so they differ according to their intended audience in their focus, detail, the number of illustrations, the overall tone, but they share an attempt to turn the specialized knowledge of science into common sense. So 과학 세계, for example, again the one on the far left, had monthly features titled Science and Everyday Life, or Science as Hobby, or Science is Power. Some of these also had columns that were called Common Sense, where they tried to explain common social and scientific phenomena. So in their own words, they attempted to liberate science from the mystery in which it was shrouded and to demonstrate that science was a practical skill that could be taken up by anyone, anywhere. So I'm going to give a couple of examples now, and I think that what I find that's really interesting when I present this material, I just presented it the other day at the Association for Asian Studies, is that there are, and you know, I'd be curious to hear from you as well, some of these are really recognizable to people who grew up both in South Korea, maybe in the United States as well. So I think there's a really common Cold War culture that I think emerges from these magazines, which I think is really interesting to think about. So that's why those of us who study North Korea always have to study it within the broader context, both of the Cold War and the socialist kind of bloc, but also within kind of this divide both across the Iron Curtain. So we're also looking at the way science developed, for example, in South Korea and the United States. And there are many, many similarities. So for example, in this essay, Let us raise the flag of science and move forward. The noun science here is modified by the adjective true. So here I'm talking more about how, again, science becomes couched in this kind of moral language. So here's a quote from this essay. Above all, we must first study and learn true science so as to dedicate all of our power to it. Here the author is not referring to a particular discipline of science, but rather an approach to science that involves observation for the sake of uncovering the laws of nature that will lead to social and economic development that will benefit the collective. The essay contrasts the way that science is practiced in South Korea, which is for its own sake, unsystematically, driven by futile fantasy, ambition, superstition, and spirits. By contrast, science in North Korea is called sincere science that must be practiced with a sincere attitude, tenacity, and with refined patriotic ideology. The frequent use of the term 고상, or refined values, refined patriotic ideology, it functions both as an aesthetic and also as a moral term. It indexes a sophisticated understanding of social relations and the unwavering and noble commitment to advance science that will bring about development for everyone. And I think that that's one of the things that really comes out of these materials. If we talk about, socialist science, what is being brought up here is that this is science that is dedicated both to improve the quality of life for everyone, not for a relative few. And so it's about democratizing and spreading knowledge that used to be the privy of a small elite group, making science available to all, but also creating a kind of development that will raise everyone and not just benefit a small, a number of, or elite group, as I said. So how did writers themselves of these magazines talk about morality? So in their words, I quote, "Morality is a set of life norms that instructs us on how to behave in the social world, a set of values that aims at true liberation developed by and among workers. Ours is the most progressive and noble morality in the world." So science and general interest magazines were particularly useful, I argue, for teaching morality, and more specifically in restructuring, as I said, two important relationships in moral terms, youth and nature and youth and community. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples now, and I'll try and wrap up soon. So the restructuring of the relationship between the individual and collective in moral terms took place in magazines in the 1950s, and they were reinforced in such sections as this one, which is called the Binocular Corps, or 망원경 부대, which was a monthly section that kind of threw a binocular spotlight on positive and negative behavior. And so you can see here, just from this one example, sorry, this is really small, that's really small. I'm sorry about it's hard to see, but I'll hopefully be able to describe it to you a little bit more. But on the left-hand side, you have positive behaviors, right? And again, this is all about how one should relate to the group and also how one should relate or should be in the world. So it's both interpersonal, but also kind of an environmental, how to behave with stuff around you. So on the left-hand side, you have a positive example of someone who is treating communal property with respect. Everyone is cleaning together and working together. And on the right-hand side, you have kids sitting on desks with their legs spread, their shoes are on the desk. It's terrible. Okay. Then the one under that, you have on the left-hand side instructions that you should always be walking on the left-hand side of the street. And then on the right-hand side, you see what happens when you don't respect the environment and you don't comply to that order. You bump into a really nice halmoni, a nice grandma who is just walking on the where she needs to be. And then the bottommost image, you have, the caption there reads, your desks are not parallel bars. So doing your calisthenics is very important. You have that on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see a kid that's fooling around and not doing what he's supposed to be doing. So I find this also interesting visually, where the proper behavior on the left-hand side is also, in terms of the visual layout, is very geometric, and you have the horizontal and vertical lines, and things kind of are sitting where they should be sitting in the image, while as on the right-hand side, you have a lot of vertical, diagonal lines, you have stars, you have squiggles, you have, all of these sort of very disruptive angles, and so it's really sort of illustrating visually this kind of grammar of order and disruption. Okay, so up until now, and this is in that magazine, Searchable New Generation, which also had also a lot of these scientific and philosophical texts. So until now, I'm trying to show how morality finds its way into a lot of these, this early material. So, okay, I'm going to try and go a little bit faster. So in this section, I talk, it's called, I title it The Story of Data, and here I draw more on narrative theory, which concerns itself with the relationship between an event and the representation of that event in language. So when we talk about science writing, and this is one of the really fun things about this new project that I'm doing, is that I get a chance to think about science not just as presenting representation of data that is completely stripped of any kind of linguistic energy. That's a kind of maybe fancier way of saying that, we tend to think about science as really just for scientists. But in fact, what research scholarship has shown is that even scientists working on scientific papers and or publishing in scientific journals, they use language in a way that is also suasive, that also carries with it certain cultural assumptions. And so, therefore, we are justified in looking at even a seemingly straightforward article like this, which is travel to the universe, that's talking about the launch of the satellites by the Soviets in 1962. It details the experience of the pilots, it describes their daily routines, and it conveys their personal greetings to all socialist nations. So this is a kind of very straightforward essay. And so you're thinking, okay, what can I do with this? How is this material for me to study a kind of moral or suasive language? So sure enough, I read it, and then there's a sentence there about how with this double launch, the Soviets have basically left the Americans in the dust. And they use this very kind of strong expression, 까마득하게 떨고 넣었다. It's really sort of dismissive of the Americans. And so here you have instances where seemingly, as I said, straightforward reportage actually has a lot of this moral and also ideological language. And so it helps me kind of understand how knowledge about the world is being built. And so the question that I am asking going forward is what happens when science passes through language, when scientific content is presented in narrative form. The process of embedding science in writing, both fictional and nonfiction, demands a moral framing that was central to North Korea's nation identity in the 1950s. Without science and technology, material recuperation would not have been possible. And without material progress, the social and political projects would fail. So it was in the narratives of magazines for young North Korean readers that the scientific and the moral could be brought together. But the power of language in narrative form to shape the moral landscape of young readers is also what rendered it volatile. This was because language opened itself to interpretation, and also because there was a space into which language did not have access, and that was the space of the mind, the field of imagination, what they called 공상. The frontier of the imagination was the ultimate target for moral and scientific narratives because it proved both the site of the greatest hope and also of the greatest anxiety. For science and morality to be effective, young people's imagination had to be primed and guided. And that is my third and final argument, and I will just say, I'll just read this quote and end with that. Lee Gi-young, who's a very important writer in North Korea, writes in 1959 in the magazine Searchable the following: as the protagonist of the Chalima generation, you students must dream big about the goals of tomorrow. Spread the wings of fantasy, get in step with the new generation of space travelers, and together take an active role on the stage of science and creativity. And so what I show in this last part of the article, which is coming out, so you'll be able to read it, later, is that there was all this anxiety about fantasy, because fantasy was really important, but because, as I argue, it's in the space of the mind, that language, and that's not reachable. It was very, very important to make sure that fantasy is structured and imagination is structured properly. And so in post-liberation North Korea, the urgency to build a socially cohesive and technically advanced country was predicated, I argue, on the moral restructuring of the young. Scientific content in science and literary magazines proved to be an effective site for this goal. In particular, the power of narrative and its mobilization of language showed itself to be an effective conduit of moral behavior. But the anxiety over the slippage of language and the or extra-linguistic site of imagination showed itself to be a persistent source of concern. A focus on the narrative devices that worked to reshape moral thought and to conquer the frontier of fantasy demonstrates the way in which the war for science and technology was waged with the power of story. So that is the material that I'm interested in, and just finally, I put some images here of the many, many magazines that we have here in the Library of Congress, and I will end now and open the floor for questions. So thank you very much for listening. So, yeah, I'll just take questions. Yes, sir, yeah.
I would be willing to bet that in North Korea, well-established scientists are probably more willing to be engaged in actual communication to the general population. In the United States, there has been, in many instances, a situation where really established scientists are déclassés if they do that too much. I think of Carl Sagan, who was a great popularizer of science in our country and was very effective, but according to some reports, was denied election to the National Academy of Sciences because even though substantively he had the credentials, the popularization aspect of his career was too prominent. I'm willing to bet that things are different in North Korea, but I don't really know.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I'm really focused on the 50s and 60s. I can't really speak about contemporary North Korea. I mean, that would be fascinating, but so I can't really speak to the situation now, but I can only say that indeed, I mean, what makes this period so interesting is this push for the popularization of science, and the people that are being represented, the scholars that are writing in these magazines for young readers are the president of Kim Il-sung University, they are they're politicians, they are community members, they are teachers, they're professors, and so they are writing these essays for young readers. So I think that in fact it is the case that the popularization of science, making science, giving access to science for all of the North Korean population, along with quickly eradicating illiteracy and getting kids into schools, it was really, really important. So thank you for that comment. Yes?
You mentioned a couple of things at the beginning. One, you're not able to go to the current administration visit North Korea, although there are certain terms that allow people to go.
Yeah.
It seems like Library of Congress would fit into that category.
Yeah.
But even if you got there, and in connection to the defectors, obviously many of the defectors today are not going to be familiar with this material that you study.
Right.
It's come out of North Korea a long time ago.
That's right.
What is the thoughts on what exists that's stored? Because none of this information is all pre-Juche and Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, greatest hits, or what's being told people today.
Right.
Where any of this information even exists, have you heard anything from other folks that have been able to go? Is there anything you mentioned from Europe or other places where they've got access to material that exists, or is that all been destroyed?
Yeah, well, I would venture to guess that the Library of Congress, I mean, if one day, hopefully, there will be peaceful resolution and, and North Korea will be open to this kind of archival research, I would venture to guess that what we have here is probably, more and better preserved than what is in North Korea. And I think that because the regime has proven to really want to rewrite and revise its history based on who is in power. And so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this earlier material, especially this kind of material that lends itself to multiplicity of voices, you can read this is what's so exciting about this period is that you can read into it ways in which North Koreans are still trying to figure out what some of the possibilities are. There's a kind of a polyphony, I would say, of ideas and stances that perhaps would not fit later on with regime. So I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that once we do get access, that there's going to be a wonderful library where all these materials can be stored, because while we have a lot here, and as I said, I'm going to Moscow in May, and I'm hoping to see other materials that we don't have, it would be wonderful to have it all in one place. But I think that what we have at the Library of Congress is probably the most complete picture that we will ever get access to. So I hope I'm wrong.
Just a follow-up, you mentioned Russia, but how about Soviet Union, China, and Japan materials?
Yeah, so China, especially Yanbian, so this is the area that is across from North Korea, they also tend to have a lot of materials. I'm not sure how strong their earlier historical material is. The colleagues that I collaborate with and work with, Andre Schmidt from the University of Toronto, and Susie Kim from Rutgers, and Charles Armstrong from Columbia, and others that are working on North Korea, Ruth Barraclough in the Australian National University, we've all sort of come to the conclusion that the materials at the Library of Congress and Moscow seem to be among the most complete, but there are pockets, there are places, and so that's part of our job, is to kind of figure out where these places are. But those seem to be the quote-unquote easiest places to get access. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, back there.
Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm really fascinated by the modes for literary production in North Korea. I can get a sense that there is a wide readership, but I'm not, the idea of being an author there is really strange and abstract to me. So could you give us some background on, what your sense of being a writer in North Korea was then, and how that occupation has perhaps changed?
Yeah, that's a great dissertation topic. So if you want to write it, I will fully support it. Yeah, no, this is a really great question, and it's unfortunately, again, it's one of the challenges of working with an archive like this that has not been looked at really anywhere, is that I don't, when I come across these names, unless they're identified in the text, I don't know a lot of the times who these people are. And so it's a great question, and the question of, who these writers are, how they came to write for, whether, how how the editing process worked, how the materials were circulated. These are all things that I, at this point, am not able to really get a good sense of. I think that, but I should say that I have a colleague at the University of Binghamton, Emmanuel Kim, who just published a book out of Hawaii Press about North Korean literature. So it's one of the, we have 2 books on North Korean literature, and his is this brand new one. He actually has a relationship with one of the North Korean authors that he writes about. And just the other day we were talking, he was telling us about how when he traveled to North Korea, he met with him several times, and he had submitted questions in advance, and the author had responded to the questions. And when they met in North Korea, in Pyongyang, they were accompanied by the minder, because we always have these minders that are there to make sure that the information that gets passed is transparent. But the author had apparently typed out 60 pages of his responses, and the minder just sat there, and Emmanuel just went through, and he was deliberately very, very slow, because he was, hoping that the guy would just say, oh, the hell with it, just take it and read it on your own time. But the minder waited, he said 3.5 hours for him to go through every single page. And so I think at this time, questions about readership would be much better posed to my colleague Emmanuel. But it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to it. I'm sorry. Yeah. So did you want to ask a question?
Yes. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, to what extent was international relations and politics woven into the moral education? For example, when they were promoting learning science, did they talk about, the Soviet Union is to be respected, and we work with them, or was it more like, self-reliance, and Kim Il-sung is the God, and you figure it out yourself? I'm
Right.
just curious about that.
Yeah, no, great question. So the reason, again, I love working on the 50s and 60s, that it is more of the former and less of the latter. And so absolutely, when you read the magazines from the 1950s in North Korea, it is so international. There are travels, all over the Soviet bloc. There are, as I said, there are Soviets that are scientists that come into North Korea. There are North Koreans going overseas. There's so much exchange. It's so rich. And so absolutely, there is a sense that North Korea is extremely international. It's a proud part of the socialist bloc, and it is very much kind of up in step with what is happening in the Soviet Union and other countries. So the children that are reading, or the young people reading these magazines, are definitely made to see themselves as a part of a broader, a broad kind of republic of socialist children around the world. So yeah, thank you. Sir, yes.
I just wonder, those publications basically published by the government or public entities, and about the research, basically it's funded by public, or you have a private research, and then eventually the product, the profit is who is getting the profit.
Right, great question. And again, I'm not in a really good place right now to be able to answer it completely, but my understanding from what I've seen until now, there are no private publications. These are not commercial enterprises. These are all public institutions, and the process of publishing, as it was in South Korea as well, is controlled very closely. And there's censorship. There are multiple steps in which writers have to submit their writing. And so, it's, I would say, non-for-profit. These are magazines that are looked at very, very closely, and are they're only they're public, or I would say kind of national publishing houses. So again, that's to say that there is very strict censorship that is controlled, but it's also the case for South Korea, where especially with the American military government, they watched South Korean publications very closely to kind of smell out any sort of pro-communist kind of tendencies. So I'm not an expert on this period, the kind of the publishing industry as I would like to be. But my sense is that, yes, the case is that there was no private publishing. So in the back, did you have a question?
Did you give me a sense of these comic books, are the students reading them, or how do you know, does it fit into the curriculum?
Right.
You see all these books, like the cartoon books, you still see the current ones that come out now.
Right.
You can't tell, is it part of the school curriculum, and who's reading, or they just kind of like, marketing material?
Right. So again, these are things that I think are a little bit more difficult to gauge, barring a kind of more extensive research on reader reception in North Korea from the 50s to 60s. And you can imagine that's a little bit challenging. I mean, my answer to that is that we can tell to a certain extent that there is reader participation, because you get these, in every issue there are always reader letters that are sent to the editor. So you get voices from readers, and they're always the location from which they are writing, and the name of their school and their age is written down. So you kind of see that, a lot of these magazines are being picked up by young readers from all over the country. And so, but we don't have circulation numbers. There's not been that kind of research done on these magazines quite yet. So I can't say for certain, but within the magazine, as I read them, I see that they are kind of talking about the importance, the importance that they view as their materials as supplementary to school. So the sense is that, yes, there are textbooks, the children are in school, but these magazines are meant to kind of as enrichment, as further studying. And again, with reader letters that are embedded in these magazines, you get a sense of how broad geographically these readers are spread out.
Sorry to ask, do you see a connection between the current emphasis on finding students who are good at science and going into technical studies? That's what I noticed listening to your talk. Yeah. That was a priority then, it's a priority now.
Yeah. You know what, I can't really speak now because my interests sort of, I've bracketed them at the 1960s, but my guess, and I don't have that image here, that's too bad. I have a guy that I know who is in North Korea who works with one of these tour groups, and he has recently sent me this fantastic collection of postcards from the science, there's a science center, like a science world or whatever, in Pyongyang. That is delightful and colorful, and so my sense is that scientific education and identifying science and STEM is as important now in North Korea as it has ever been. So I'm sorry, I can't take more. Can I take more questions?
I feel like I'm a parent who's trying to send the kids to bed and, Mom, we want to stay longer. You know, I feel awful, but we better wrap it up. Maybe she'll hang around a few minutes.
Sure,
So
absolutely.
you can ask her later, but we have to close up. So it's just so thank you to Dr. Dafna Zur and share her journey and the insight with us. It's just so marvelous.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thanks again for coming for our event. Actually, I think most of put your name signed. If you have not, please do so, because that kind of justify we need to have this kind of event more often. Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.